In the tranquility of the night, some stories quietly come to life. Welcome to Hauntings and Horrors. Now, I will take you through a chilling tales. What a steal. I thought I couldn't believe my luck when I was browsing the net for houses. My hand had been forced lately, as my landlord was selling the place that I was currently renting. In fact, I'd been renting for the past 8 years. This was my home, and now, unless I found a new place soon, I would soon be homeless. Over the past decade, I'd luckily been able to put some money away into my savings account for a rainy day. Thankfully, that rainy day had never come. I had a job that paid decently well. My rented apartment was in very good condition, and my car was very reliable. I'd always taken care of my teeth as well, so I didn't have to pay exorbitant amounts for any dental work. I didn't even spend any money on takeout. As a result, I had a sizable nest egg sitting in my account, doing nothing enough for a deposit on a house and maybe some renovations to boot. I'd always wanted a big place. Since I was little, I would see millionaires having huge mansions filled with exciting and interesting things. They'd have swimming pools, tennis courts, and a huge driveway big enough to fit 10 cars. I thought that this would always remain a pipe dream until I spotted a post online amongst a list of houses for sale. Most were very modest. With my budget, I was expecting to be able to afford a one-bed, one-bath house at the most, and probably not in the safest area. I could just rent again, I thought, but I wasn't getting any younger and had to think of my future. I may as well just be setting my monthly rent payment on fire for all the good it's doing me. Nestled amongst these houses, I spotted a listing for what looked like a much bigger place. I had to do a double take to make sure I was reading things right, because after a second look it could be considered a mansion. For all intents and purposes, it must be a typo, I thought as I read the listing in more detail. Plastered over the listing were phrases such as needs work, considerable red additions required, a true fixer-upper, and many more. Looking at the numerous pictures provided of the inets of the property, it definitely looked like it could do with some work. Sure, the wallpaper was faded and not very modern. The carpets were dirty and frayed. Some of the brickwork was damaged, and the bathrooms had seen better days. Considering the price, though it seemed too good to be true in hindsight, it absolutely was. Considering my tight time frame before being evicted, I swiftly called the estate agent and arranged a viewing. I wasn't sure if I would ever get a deal like this again, fully expecting to have a lot of competition for the place. I was very surprised to hear that the estate agent could see me that afternoon. I jumped at the chance. Sable Manor was the name I was given, along with direct directions. It was a full hour's drive from where I currently lived, but I was eager to move out of the suburbs anyway. I enjoyed my peace and quiet, and after looking at an online map, it certainly seemed as though I would get it. I jumped into the car, entered the address into my save, and set off excited to see potentially the home of my dreams. After coming off of the motorway, the save event eventually asked me to turn right off of the main road onto a quaint country road. Either side of the road were open fields filled with countless sheep, cows, and horses. I could get used to this, I thought. As time went on, the road began to get narrower and narrower. The surface of the road also got worse and worse. However, undeterred, I pressed on. After 15 minutes or so, it was announced I had reached my destination. I slowed the car to a stop, and I found myself sitting at a dilapidated wooden front gate. There were some rusted iron letters on the brick pillar next to it. Sable Manor. As I was taking in the scenery, I could hear the rumble of metal behind the gate. It slowly opened to reveal the estate agent I had spoken to a few hours beforehand. He beckoned me to drive through the gate with one hand, as he held the gate open with the other. I slowly navigated the car through the opening, lowering my window to briefly greet him before making my way up the gravel path. The substance crunched beneath my wheels, as I could see the estate agent closing the gate behind me in my rearview mirror. Slowly crawling my way up the path and curving around to the right, the matter came into view. The outer facade of the building was certainly in need of repair, but for the price they were asking, it wasn't the end of the world. In fact, with a bit of love and attention, it seemed as though this could be my forever home. I climbed out of the car and waved to the man crunching his way up the path. He had the same vacant, slightly uncanny smile the all-estate agent seemed to wear. We briefly greeted each other, at which point he unlocked the large oak door and let us inside. The door swung open with a huge creak. We stepped into the ground foyer of the building. The floorboards creaked under our weight and the large room was punctuated by a huge rustic fireplace. It had a huge set of what I assumed were deer antlers over the hearth. Pretty impressive, said the agent, as he saw my gaze affixed on the centerpiece. I let my eyes wander around the room. There was a staircase up to the first floor on the right-hand side. Old dusty paintings hung on the wall next to it, full of impressive landscapes and majestic animals. The previous owner must have been a hunter of some sort. I looked upwards at the ceiling. While the design was intricate, there were a few cracks in the glass among the considerable number of cobwebs. Luckily, spiders had never bothered me. As you can see, the place needs quite a lot of work, but hopefully you'll agree. The sheer character of the place more than makes up for it. The man said. I nodded as I made my way up the staircase. I used the wooden banister to steady myself as my hand traced up the staircase. I looked at it as I reached it to top. It was covered in a thick blanket of dust. It was clear that no one had cleaned the place in months, if not years. The place has been on the market for quite a while. I could hear from behind me alongside a cacophony of creaking. We were actually trying to sell the Mona on behalf of a debt collection agency. By all accounts, the previous owner owed quite a lot of money. This piqued my interest. Oh, really? They must have been quite well off to own this place. Surely you would think so, wouldn't you? But as I understand it, they inherited the manor from a distant member of their family, some long-lost uncle, I would imagine. They lived here for quite a few years but didn't have a regular job. Apparently, best guess is that they made some money here and there from selling game to butchers, pheasants meat. You get the idea. But, as you can probably get, yes, they didn't have enough cash to renovate. As I poked my head into the various rooms on the first floor, I nodded my head and murmured in the affirmative to let him know I was listening. Something began to gore at me, though, as he was speaking. Eventually the whisper in my mind became more of a yell. I had to ask so. This gentleman was quite old. I take it couldn't pay off his debts before he passed. He was no spring chicken by any means, but not that kind of age. The rumor was he ran into some kind of accident on a hunt. The place was found abandoned, just disappeared. The police did an in-depth investigation, but no trace of him. I hope you're not the squeamish type, but the rumor was that he fell foul of a bull or some other creature in the remote woods and was never found. As you probably saw on your drive here, we're surrounded by woodland for miles and miles around. The police don't have that kind of manpower to search hundreds of miles of remote woodland. So he was declared missing and presumed dead. Well, after that, I didn't exactly want this guy bursting through the door, so I had to ask the follow-up question. And when was that recently? He was declared to have perished by the police around 14 months ago. Now, it's just taken a while for the paperwork and proceeds to work their way through. It's your lucky day. He patted me on the back. He was certainly very forthcoming with the information. It wasn't as though he was trying to hide anything from me, and I did need a place very soon. This information didn't put me off much. I always wanted a place that was away from the hustle of the town, and I loved old-fashioned buildings with character. I'd have to do any renovations in bits and pieces, but that didn't bother me. It wasn't as if the building was going to fall down any second. It just needed some love. We continued to explore the model for a while until we arrived back in the main foyer. Well, we haven't seen everything this place has to offer, but I'm afraid I have other appointments. Hopefully you all agree. It's got a lot of character, and, with a bit of tender, loving care, could be a perfect home for you in time. Just let me know if you want to make an offer. I'm sure we'll have other interest in the place soon. He was laying it on a bit thick with the sales pattern, but he was right. It was run down and needed quite a lot of work, but I kind of fell in love with the place as soon as I stepped inside. I've always been a bit of an eccentric, and even when I was a kid, I dreamed of living in a manor like this, having unique pieces of artwork and paintings, a rustic kitchen, old leather chairs sitting by the fireplace, that kind of thing. I didn't want to let on, though, so I just said to him, "I'll let you know." As I left the house and drove back down the country road, with the agent gradually getting smaller in my rearview mirror, I was already on the phone to my solicitor. I wanted it badly. The sale had gone through like clockwork. In fact, I was pleasantly surprised by how painless it was. The price was agreed and was well within my budget. In fact, I had plenty left over to start renovations. Less than 6 weeks after I first saw the place, I was collecting the keys, my dream home. As I locked the gate behind the estate agent with keys in hand, I stood there in silence and took in a deep breath, peace and quiet. I could hear the birds twittering in the trees, the sound of the wind rustling through the autumn leaves. It was almost as if nature was trying to speak to me. "You're home," I imagined it was saying. 2 weeks after the sale, I effectively moved in. I didn't have much to move from my old place. I always lived within my means and didn't collect many possessions. I was a big believer in experiences over things. Now I was looking forward to spending my first night in my new home. My new home. Mine. It felt weird saying it. I spent most of my first day looking through each of the rooms and making a note of any remedial work that needed doing. By the evening, I'd filled at least 10 pages. I always liked undertaking big projects, though, so this didn't put me off. I was just excited to have my own place. It was peculiar, though. As soon as you shut the front door, it was as if you had created a vacuum inside. There was no noise at all. You couldn't hear any birds, any wind, anything at all. It was as if you had stepped into another dimension. Luckily, the electric still worked. I had to get someone in eventually to check all of the wiring and make sure it wasn't dangerous, but for the time being I could use my sparse collection of electronic equipment. It looked quite out of place alongside the quaint eclectic furniture, but by the old fireplace and in front of a weathered red leather armchairs and my 60-inch TV. I didn't have internet yet, so I had to make do with my trusty DVD player that luckily I'd kept in a storage box. I never liked throwing things away besides. Otherwise, what would I do with my collection of classic horror movies? Still in the storage box, I had hundreds of movies that I collected over the years. So I connected my DVD player to the TV and loaded one of my favorites with a cup of hot chocolate and a packet of biscuits in hand. I plunked down in a comfortable armchair and raised my hand to turn on the stylish lamp on my right. At that moment, I couldn't have been happier as the light outside faded. It began to grow colder. I looked in a large metal container sitting next to the fireplace and found some very old pieces of firewood. After inspecting them closely, they must have been there for years. Importantly, though, they weren't damp. In fact, they were bone dry. Now was as good a time as any, I thought, as I loaded the wood into the opening in the fireplace. After a few attempts, I managed to get a fire started with the help of some of the newspaper I'd used to pack some ornaments. As is tradition, I stood in front of the fire for a few moments, warmed up my hands and rubbed them together. I then settled back down in my chair to the sound of blood-curdling screams on the TV and crackling wood beside me. After around 15 minutes, I noticed that despite the roaring fire close by, there was still a noticeable chill. Strangely, it seemed to be a draft coming from somewhere. I was some distance from the front door, so it couldn't be that I scanned around and I wasn't close to any doors at all. As a matter of fact, the draft had to be coming from somewhere. It certainly wasn't from the fireplace, as there was a ravenous fire there. Now, in fact, I had just fed it some more wood. I got up and started searching for the source of the cold draft. I've made my list of renovations and improvements now, and didn't want to miss any. I wanted my new home to be nice and cozy. After a while, I loved nothing more than in warmth while it was cold outside. After a while of searching, feeling along the cracks of the various doorways and floorboards, I realized that the cold air was coming from the middle of the room in the area just to the left of the bottom of the staircase. I couldn't see anything, though. All I could see was the tattered old Persian rug laid on the floor covering the floorboards. Although it was frayed and clearly had been well used by the previous owners, it had a certain character about it, so I wanted to keep it. The rug was threadbare in places, though, and can't have been doing a good job of insulating against the cold. I placed my hand at the edge of the rug and, sure enough, a nice cold blast of air chilled my fingers with care. I slowly rolled back the carpet in an attempt to identify what could possibly be causing such a draft. I imagined it would be a loose or missing floorboard. One more for the list. As I rolled the rug back on itself, a large wooden hatch came into view. It would have been difficult to spot, if not for the recessed metal handle on one side. The handle was rusted beyond all recognition and was quite large. This wasn't in the floor plan, I thought as I paced slowly around the hatch, feeling a bizarre sense of both trepidation and excitement. While I did have some money to renovate, I didn't have enough to do everything. If this hatch leads to a basement, there could be all kinds of heirlooms and treasures in there which could pay for the renovations 10 times over. The sheer curiosity got the better of me. I removed my phone from my back pocket and turned on the flashlight. The dazzling white light provided a stark contrast against the warm orange glow being provided by the fire. I slowly bent down and grabbed the rusted handle. It provided some resistance, but after a sharp tug it came loose and allowed me to get some leverage on the hatch. As I pulled upwards, the hatch gave way surprisingly easily. I pushed the door up onto its hinges, and once it reached the fulcrum, it fell backwards in the opposite direction, slamming onto the floor with a loud thump. A cloud of dust erupted into the air. Illuminated by the glow of the fire, I shined my phone flashlight into the dark opening. All I could see was a collection of wooden steps heading downwards. They were covered in dust and there was a thick sheet of cobwebs. It was clear that no one had been down here for a while, but at least I had found the source of the draft. Now that the hatch was open, there was a strong stream of icy cold air collecting around my feet. Taking a gulp, I slowly traveled down the steps, hoping that the wood wasn't so rotted that it would give way. Thankfully, the steps held firm. I counted the number of steps in my head as I went 12, 13, 14, 15 steps, and with each step that I took downwards, the warmth being provided by the fire quickly gave way to a cloying chill. In fact, it was so cold that, as my foot found the ground at the bottom of the steps, I could see clouds of mist whenever I breathed out. I looked back up the steps to whence I came, and all I could see was a flickering orange glow casting shadows upon the steps that took many shapes. As the fire ebbed and flowed, holding my phone up, I decided to check my battery. After all, I didn't want my phone to cut out. While I was down here, I couldn't see any light switches at all. Not surprising. It was an old house safe for few. I only planned to spend 10 minutes or so down here, just to sate my curiosity. I could fully explore the area in the morning. I'd had more than enough battery for tonight's purposes. Glancing next to the battery icon, though, I saw the words "no service." If I wanted to make this a secret games room or anything, I'd definitely need a landline down here at some point. I had plenty of signal upstairs. I surmised that the walls must have been lined with lead or something. As I held the phone in front of me, I could see a long passageway with a concrete floor. At the end of the passageway, I could just about see the glint of metal. I crept down the hallway, and as I got closer, I saw a riveted gun needle gray door, similar to what you would expect to see on a ship or a submarine. Weird, I muttered under my breath. The door was ajar, so after a short pause to gather myself, I eased the door open. It took most of my body weight to push it open, but it gave way eventually with a drawn-out creak. If you would have heard that noise in isolation, you would have thought you were on a submarine with the haunting creaks associated to the vessel. The air was stale and even colder than before. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw what was in this room. The room couldn't have been more than a few meters long, but the walls were curved and they weren't made of wood or brick. They were made of metal. A weathered light fitting hung down in the center of the room from the ceiling. I felt around the wall by the doorway for a light, which in after a few seconds found one. I flicked the switch and at first nothing happened. A short while after I began to hear a muffled shuddering sound coming from another room, at which point the light flickered into life, casting a dull orange glow. In many ways it was similar to the glow of the fire upstairs, but this was artificial. It felt alien. In some uncanny way, I turned off my flashlight to save the battery and placed it back into my pocket. On one side of the room there was a very basic bed with a dark brown blanket and flat pillows. The air smelled musty. These clearly hadn't been washed for a long time, if ever. On the other side of the room was an electric stove with various old packets of military rations and canned goods. As I picked up some of the goods, most of them were at least 10 years old. I didn't want to try any of them right now, but it sounded like quite an interesting project for a day in the future. As I placed the cans down, the realization dawned on me this must be a fallout shelter. That would certainly explain the lack of phone reception. The idea always fascinated me, but I'd never seen one in the wild. The old owner of the manor must have been a survivalist of some sort. I surmised that would certainly explain the antlers and other paraphernalia. In the rest of the manor, towards the back of the room, I saw another doorway stepping carefully between the cooking and the sleeping areas. I walked through the opening. Here was another small room smaller than the one I just left. The loud shuddering was much louder. Here, grabbing my phone from my pocket again, as I couldn't see another light switch, I pointed it towards the source of the noise, a generator that would explain the light suddenly working. The walls of this room were completely bare metal again, but rusting in some places recessed into the wall. Close to the generator I could see a small wash basin and toilet. I'm not sure they'd ever been used. Walking up to the basin, I turned the tap with great difficulty. It spluttered loudly for a good 10 seconds. But eventually brown water started to spurt through the opening. Water must have been sitting in these pipes for years, I said to myself. I quickly turned off the tap. It was much easier to turn now that I had loosened it. I moved the light in my hand around the small room and noticed another aperture opposite to the generator. It was another riveted metal door identical to the first. This one had a glass porthole of sorts. The air was ice cold. Now I began to regret not wearing more layers. I shone my torch through the glass, but it was incredibly cloudy. I couldn't make out anything at all. The door had a large letter, almost like you'd see on an air low CK. Taking a deep breath, I moved the lever downwards. With that I could hear a sharp intake of air, as if a vacuum seal was broken. As soon as this happened, a blast of ice cold air hit me with force. What the hell, I guessed. I swung the heavy door open, and it clanked loudly. Once it hit the wall, I cautiously shone my torch into the opening and took a step inside. The concrete floor in the room had tiny ice crystals on it which crunched as my shoe hit them. As I lifted my phone up to scan around the room, I could see slabs of meat hung on hooks. Underneath them were metal tables with various cutting implements laid upon them. It was a huge freezer. Of course, he hunted animals. I said to no one talk about an endless supply of food. It was a perfect setup. Spend years building up a supply of meat and food for the potential scenario of nuclear war. It didn't look like it would have been much of a life if it did happen, but at least he would have been alive and, with the generator, no trouble at all in keeping this stuff frozen. Real meat, I'm sure, would have been far more preferable to canned food. I stared in amazement at what looked like years of work. My attention was drawn to another metal table on the other side of the freezer. There were from this distance what appeared to be cards strewn across the surface. As I approached, I could see that these were mostly white plastic cards of some sort. Although I had difficulty in feeling my fingers now, I fumbled for one of the cards and picked it up in my hand. One side was completely blank, but as I flicked it over between my numbed fingers, my mouth dropped open. I was faced with the image of a bespectacled man. He had long ginger hair and a scruffy beard. While the beard did him no favors, it looked like he was no older than 35. In fact, I could tell exactly how old he was to the day. He was 33 years and 143 days old. I knew this because the card contained his birth date next to his picture, along with his address. It must have been a driving license or some other form of ID. Was this the mysterious hunter who disappeared? His name was William Smith. Then my eyes wandered from the card in my hand to the dozen other cards on the table. Grasping another, I was faced with the picture of another person, this time a young woman with shoulder length, black hair, no older than 21. Again, this had her birth date on it, so I knew for certain she was approaching her 20th birthday. This person's name was Emily Brown. Frantically, I began picking up the other cards clumsily in my hands. James Miller, Nora Wilson, Michael Davis, Sarah Johnson. All in all, there were 16 ideas here. What the hell, I mouthed silently as I held the cards in my hands. In panic, I pushed one of the huge slabs of meat with my full body weight out of the way and pointed my phone towards the door to get out as soon as I could. But before I could do that, my attention was drawn to yet another metal table in the corner that had been previously obscured by the hanging meat. I almost threw up in my mouth. Sitting there on the table, gray and frosted, was a human foot severed at the ankle. As my eyes widened at the realization, I let out a loud primal scream in terror and stumbled towards the opening. My foot slipped from under me in the panic and I came crashing to the floor, bringing the table containing the ideas down with me in a clatter and crash of metal. With that, my phone slipped out of my hand and smashed on the concrete floor. Luckily, there was still some ambient lights coming from the main room that I could use to find my way. With my ankle throbbing, I struggled to my feet and began retracing my steps out through the bunker, hobbling every step of the way past the rumbling generator, past the dilapidated stove, past the military-style bed. As I steadied myself on the wall, with one trembling hand, I grazed something in the lights which flicked off. Too terrified to care, I held the narrow wall on both sides with my hands. The glow from the fire upstairs was acting as a beacon for me. I needed to get out. Every step was sending bolts of pain through my leg. but I struggled along. I just had to make it up those 15 steps. As I placed my foot upon the bottom step, I heard a prolonged creak. The comforting orange glow of the fire emanating from the opening above me became dimmer strange in the space of a single second. Another loud creak, followed by a tremendous thump, and then darkness. December 1st, or at least I think that's what the date is. It's difficult to tell anymore. I've been counting the days by my number of sleeps, as I can't see any daylight. I haven't seen any daylight for at least a month. This place is a pen and paper. That's how I'm telling you this. If I didn't have this, I think I would go insane. I write stories just like this one. Only this one is real. I don't know what this person plans to do with me, as I'm sure he would have murdered me by now if he wanted to do that. Maybe he's looking for a companion during the nuclear apocalypse. Maybe he's planning on hunting me for sport. I don't know. I can't bring myself to eat the human flesh. I'd sooner starve. I've been surviving on the canned food. There should be enough to last for another month. Maybe two. Before long, though, there will be nothing left beside what's in the freezer. If anyone ever finds this, tell my story, and I hope you get revenge on whoever has done this. Unless, of course, they get you too. The stories have been told, but their shadows will continue to haunt our minds. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to Hauntings and Horrors. Turn on notifications, so you won't miss any thrilling horror stories. Good night, and sweet dreams.